specializations, but there's very little asked on that. And lumbar, no specializations. So before I do sacrum and coccyx, I'll just do a little bit atlas axis. There might be one question total or something like that, but so I'm gonna keep it relatively straightforward because on the final, there's very straightforward questions. And we might have gone into more detail, but so for atlas, basically, nobody, no spinous process. Nobody, it's very specialized, nobody, no spinous process. But the main thing, only vertebra that articulates with skull. So it's the only vertebra that articulates with the skull. And I'll write two names on the board, just like it's easy to get confused between vertebral foramen and intervertebral foramen. But you know, vertebral foramen transmits spinal cord, intervertebral foramina transmits spinal nerves. So likewise, the two joints, name-wise, that look alike, atlanto-occipital joint. That's not the pivot joint. We're not going to ask what type, because most of our books now say ellipsoidal, but some books still say hinge, so we don't ask what type. But just know, atlanto-occipital between atlas and skull, or between atlas and occipital bone, but I'll just put between C1 and skull. We know it's between C1 and occipital. Same thing. Atlas is the only vertebra that articulates with the skull, and that's the atlanto-occipital joint. But the joint we probably ask more about is atlanto-axial joint. Atlanto-axial joint. And that's between C1, atlas and axis, or between C1 and C2. Between, atlanto means atlas, so between C1 and C2, and atlanto-axial, atlanto-axial. What type of joint is atlanto-axial? Synovial. What type of synovial? Pivot. Yeah, that's the famous pivot. So this is the pivot joint. So they say which joint allows for the turning or pivoting movement of the skull or head. It's the atlanto-axial is the famous pivot joint that allows for rotating, pivoting movement. Atlanto-occipital is between atlas and skull, and atlas is the only vertebra that articulates with the skull. It's really the occipital condyles and superior articular processes, but we're probably not going to ask that. The only vertebra that articulates with the skull is C1 or atlas, atlanto-occipital joint. And then between atlas and axis is atlanto-axial, C1, C2. That's the pivot joint that allows for turning, rotational movement. And I think that's atlanto-axial, pivot joint, C1 and C2. Okay, and the only other question is which vertebra, or the odontoid process, usually they say odontoid, also dens, but on most test questions they say odontoid process is a feature of which bone? A, occipital, B, C1, C, C2, D, C7. Odontoid process is a feature? C2. That's the other famous question. The odontoid process is part of the axis, or C2.
So which atlanto-occipital joint? Which is atlanto-occipital joint? What's the name?
And it means atlas occipital. It's this.
Yeah.
That's atlanto-occipital.
What kind is it?
We don't ask it. So I said it before you. I said it's either. Listen. Let me. If you stop me like this, I'm not going to finish by 5.
Okay.
I said it's ellipsoidal or hinge, but we're not going to ask it because there's controversy over what type. And it's not the pivot. It's not. You just need to know it's between atlas and occipital, nothing else. But the atlanto-axial is. Everyone agrees that's a pivot joint. I have a rule before, no questions. And otherwise, I don't finish. Otherwise, I go to 5:30, and I don't want to go to 5:30. So let me finish this, then I'll answer the questions. I already, because I'm only teaching towards the final, I'm saying what you need to know, I'm not doing other stuff. Because in the past, I did other stuff and I wound up going to 6. That's not good for anybody. And it's also, okay, anyway, next is, basically, I need to do sacrum and coccyx, but keep in mind that from here on in the axial skeleton, there are very few questions. And we spent a lot of time on sacrum, coccyx. There's almost nothing, to be quite honest. And on skull, there's just 2 or 3 questions. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on skull, and on rib cage, almost nothing. And on joint classification, maybe 3 questions, I already covered it. So, but I'll do them again. So keep in mind, I am leaving a lot of stuff out. The emphasis on the test, I did first. That's why I did appendicular skeleton first. That's the emphasis. If there's one thing emphasized the most, it's all the bones and the articular features of the upper extremity, lower extremity, and that was already covered. The rest of it is very little questions. But I'm leaving a lot of stuff out intentionally. So don't make me do it. Because it's just a waste of time at this point. I mean, it's not a waste of time knowledge, but I'm only teaching towards the final. So anyway, sacrum, it's 5 fused vertebra, but the only questions for sacrum are, which bones or how many bones does it articulate with? And it articulates with the 2 os coxa, L5, actually, and coccyx. So 4 bones total. Sacrum strategically located articulates with 4 bones, the 2 os coxa, L5, and coccyx. Okay, know that. And we did a ton of features, but the only ones I'd be aware of at this point are 4 pairs of anterior sacral foramina. There are 4 pairs of anterior. This one has 5, so ignore that. 4 pairs of posterior sacral foramina. And, mind the way? Oh, 4 pairs of anterior sacral foramina and 4 pairs of posterior sacral foramina. Don't worry about functions unless I say it. And then this lip here that sticks out, just be aware it's called sacral, no function. Sacral promontory shows up in x-rays, MRIs. So just know this little anterior lip on the upper sacrum is just called sacral, no function, just sacral promontory. And sacral canal is the last segment of the dorsal cavity or vertebral canal. It ends at sacral hiatus, don't worry about that. But the sacral canal is the very last segment of the dorsal cavity, which ends within the sacrum. And the collective bumps are called median sacral crest. That's a palpable feature, even though down the road you'll palpate that. But median sacral crest. And then the only articular surface or feature of the sacrum, or which feature of the sacrum articulates with the os coxa, and it has the same name, it's as on the os coxa, auricular surface. Just know auricular surface of sacrum to auricular surface of os coxa or ilium, that's the sacroiliacs, only joints between axial skeleton and bones of lower extremity. So it's auricular surface of sacrum to auricular surface of ilium that on both sides form sacroiliac joints. Okay, and that's everything. I covered too much, but that's everything on the sacrum. And the coccyx articulates, this is all broken, but the coccyx would articulate with sacrum only, sacrococcygeal joint. In case they ask, what's the name of the joint between sacrum and coccyx? It's like atlanto-occipital named sacrococcygeal, but we probably don't ask that, but that's the sacrococcygeal. Coccyx, also fused bone, no features. Non-weight bearing, muscle attachment, that's it for coccyx. So articulates with sacrum only, non-weight bearing, we don't ask function. It is a lot of muscle attachment. That's pretty much it. It counts as one bone, but it's basically a fused bone, non-weight bearing, muscle attachment only, articulates with sacrum only. Okay, and then The joints of the vertebral column, I can be brief. I'm going to do them again under joint classification, but these are called anterior intervertebrals, and there's a disc of fibrocartilage not shown in these, but shown here. So there's symphysis. All anterior intervertebral, no exception, are symphysis. So that's one type of joint. That means intervertebral means between any two vertebrae. So these are all anterior intervertebral, and they're all symphysis. The posterior intervertebral are between superior, and we don't ask it, but they are more posterior. They're between superior and inferior articular processes of adjacent vertebra. And all posterior intervertebral, no exception, are gliding synovial. So all, even though the movement's about the same, or they work together, the posterior intervertebral are gliding synovial, but all anterior intervertebral between the bodies of adjacent vertebrae are symphysis, non-synovial. And for ligaments, you only need to know two. I'm limiting it to just two ligaments of the vertebral column that you need to know. The one that gets asked by far the most, just know nuchal ligament or ligamentum nuchae. Same, everyone, whether they say nuchal ligament or ligamentum nuchae, it's the same exact thing. And it goes from external occipital, it goes from occipital bone, I'll just say occipital bone, to C7 spinous process, and attaches to all spinous processes. So it's just from occipital bone to C7, occipital bone to C7, and that's the nuchal ligament. Just know occipital bone to C7 spinous process. And then longitudinal ligaments, whether they're anterior or posterior, just know they attach to the bodies of all vertebrae. C2 to, because Atlas doesn't have a body, C2 to sacrum. So the only one you really need to know, anterior longitudinal, is C2 through sacrum, attaching to the bodies of all vertebrae. So that's anterior longitudinal, C2 through sacrum, attaching to all bodies. Okay, now rib cage is hardly anything, to be honest, but I'll do it. It's one sternum and 24 ribs. Okay, there might be a number question somewhere here, but I'll do that after I do all the bones. Okay, so the sternum, just know upper portion, before we do features, upper portion manubrium. If they say the superior portion, the answer is manubrium. And the most superior, what's the most inferior portion? Xiphoid process. So in between is the body. Hard to ask that, but if it's the most superior, it's manubrium. If it's the most inferior, it's xiphoid process. And all the features, we don't ask numbers here, but all the features of the sternum are notches. The only singular and the one that's not articular is jugular notch. The rest of them are articular. The rest of them articulate with the bone, and the name tells you which bone. So 2 clavicular notches, those are sternoclavicular joints. And then 7 pairs of costal notches for the 7 pairs of true ribs. So 7 pairs of costal notches, costal notch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's 7 pairs of costal notches, and rib pairs 1 through 7 are the true ribs. Inclusive, rib pairs 1 through 7 are the true ribs. So knowing that, what would be the total number of true ribs? Okay, let me give choices, because what's the total number of true ribs? A, 12, B, 14, total number C7, D, 24. What's the total number of true ribs? I heard different numbers, but there's some 14. Because there's 7 pairs of true ribs. So if they ask total, it's 7 times 2. Okay, it's 14. There's 2 possible questions, really. Total number of true ribs, 14. What's the total number of ribs? If same choices, what's the total number of ribs? 24, 12 times 2. 12 times 2, total number of ribs is 24. Total number of true ribs is 14. That would mean total number of false ribs, which we almost never ask, has to be 10. 14 and 10's got to equal there's actually 5 pairs, but we don't usually put it like that. There are 5 pairs of false ribs, but you just need to know 8 through 12. That's 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So there actually are 5 pairs of false ribs, but just know 1 through 7, true ribs, pairs, 8 through 12, false ribs, pairs. And that's good enough. And then, it's hard to ask this, but 11 and 12 are floating. They're false, but only 11 and 12 are floating ribs. They're still false and floating. 8, 9, and 10 connect indirectly. They're false, but they connect indirectly by overlying costal cartilage to sternum. And now, features of a rib, we don't really ask technical questions, but most of the ribs are body. Most of the ribs are body. And then, just know, tubercle of rib to transverse process of corresponding thoracic vertebra. Tubercle T to T. Tubercle of rib to transverse process, that's costotransverse. All of them are called costotransverse joints. They're all gliding synovial. So the tubercle of every rib to the transverse process of the corresponding number of thoracic vertebra, collectively those are costotransverse joints gliding synovial. Then forget about neck, but the head, this end of the rib, this expanded end is the head. It's always got to be an end, and the anterior end is just body. So, but the posterior end, or this part of the rib, is the head, and heads go with bodies. So head of rib, they overlap, but you just need to know head of rib to body of corresponding vertebra, thoracic vertebra. Head of rib to body of thoracic vertebra. Those are called costovertebral, to distinguish them from costotransverse. So head of rib to body of vertebra, those are collectively called costovertebral, but also gliding. So tubercle to transverse process, tubercle of rib to transverse process, thoracic vertebra, costotransverse, gliding. Head of rib to body of corresponding thoracic vertebra, called costovertebral, also gliding.